yesterday I taught section 2.2. Today I'm going to teach 2.3. It is pretty short. And then I told you tomorrow is going to be a work day. I'm also going to take a little bit of time tomorrow and kind of review some things because I would like to take a quiz before our first test, since we haven't really had one. So that would put it on Tuesday. That's not really ideal, is it? But it'll probably, I think it'll be okay. It's mostly just creating graphs and things. But I'll talk at the end of class tomorrow, probably make a little review video, and then if you needed to refresh something on Tuesday, you could. So that is the plan. Yesterday we're talking about ways to display quantitative data, and with that, we looked at what kinds of things. What were we making for our quantitative data? Yeah, we made our tables. We did histograms, which was just kind of like a bar graph, except they all touched. We talked about making classes of data. And remember, the classes, like when we had continuous data, so we might make a range. And we talked about graphing those on the graphing calculator or by hand. So we covered those different things. I want to talk today just about a couple pieces, but we really have some terms that we need to focus on. So with those classes that we looked at yesterday, we could talk about a class midpoint. So the class midpoint is just the sum of consecutive lower classes divided by 2. So yesterday we were looking at, what's the Old Faithful example, wasn't it? So our first class started at 670, the next one started at 680. So what was the class width, we said? 10. How far from the start of one to the start of the next? The class midpoint is basically the average of those two. So add them up, divide by 2, so the midpoint would be 675 for the first class. The midpoint of the second class would be 685. So that class width was 10. So once you have the first midpoint, basically you just keep adding 10 to get all the other midpoints. I don't know that I actually printed these definitions, so you might need to kind of squeeze it in the margin if you need to. It's not like it would be a definition type question on your test, but I might say find the class midpoint. You need to know what I'm talking about. And then a frequency polygon is a graph that uses points connected by line segments to represent the frequencies. And I'll show you one of those in a second. So I just wanted to, I'm going to show an example of a frequency polygon in a second. But when we're doing those, the big thing that people always mess up with frequency polygons, we're typically doing them with continuous data. And so if I have a range and it starts at 670 and it ends at 679, you have to have some kind of label on your x-axis to represent that. And we just want to put a single dot. So what we do is we put the dot above the class midpoint. So the midpoint we said would be 675, so we would go to 675 on the x-axis and then go up to our y value. So this was the example. So midpoint, I put on here the frequencies, we had those yesterday. So notice on my x-axis we've got 675, frequency was 2. The next midpoint 685, frequency of that class was 0. 695 was the next midpoint, frequency of that class was 7. The other thing, so we put dots, we connect them by lines. The frequency polygon always connects back to the x-axis. So essentially, if you're doing this on Google Sheets or something, you have to add in one more point. We started at a midpoint of 675. They're all 10 apart, so we would have to back up to 665, and we just want to start it at 0. And then we would add one more on the end, 745, back to 0. So frequency polygons, when you are using Google Sheets to make those, you have to add in the extra points at the beginning and end. Does that make sense? Alright, let's just practice making one of those on Google Sheets. I don't have any real examples in this section, so just kind of looking at one. So I'm going to make up some data here. So let's say, so I'm going to start this class. So here's the example I'm adding in. Now I want to ask you guys a couple questions. Can you tell me the class width here? Remember, the width is the distance from the beginning of one class to the beginning of the next. So the class width is 5. What if I asked you to add in the midpoints? So before we do anything on our Chromebook, we need to be able to do this. If I need the midpoints, how do I get the midpoints? We add the beginning of one class to the beginning of the next and divide by 2. So 5 plus 10 is 15, divided by 2 is 7.5. Then you could keep doing that, so 10 plus 15 divided by 2, or what we could do is once I have the first one, the class width is 5, so I should just be able to add 5 to every one and get the remaining. Is everybody with me there? So, on your Chromebook, to practice this, when you set up the Google Sheet, your first column actually needs to be the midpoints. So this will be our first, and then we put the frequency in the second column. So, once you have that data typed in, we know that on Google Sheets it's pretty easy to make tables and things. If I selected this and go to Insert Chart, I have a lot of options. What we want is the line chart. All right, now there are some different things, if you wanted to customize things, you can change colors and whatever that you might want. This is really all we have to have. However, there is a problem. This is not a true frequency polygon. Why? It doesn't connect to 0. So I need to go back to my data. And I need to add in something before and after with a frequency of 0. So remember how we got these. We had the first one, and then what did I add every time to get the next? 5. So if I do one more on the end, that would take me to 27.5. This way, if you subtract the 5, that one would take us to 2.5. So then we could just insert our chart. And we can see now it is the frequency polygon. You can go through the settings and have it put like the actual dots if you wanted. We can kind of see where they are here. And if you hover over it, does tell you as well. But that would be the frequency polygon. So you have to use the midpoints of the classes, and you have to connect it to 0 at the beginning and end. Did everyone get that to work out? Any issues at all?
Wait, why did we add the 2.5 and the 27.5.
So the rule with a frequency polygon, it's not just a line graph, it always has to connect back to the x-axis. So we just continued the pattern, we were adding 5 every time. So we went back 5 and forward 5 and connected it to the axis there. And you would have to do that every time for a frequency polygon. Sometimes you might be asked to have a cumulative frequency distribution. So the distribution, that's the table. Cumulative is kind of what it says. It's adding up everything less than or equal to. So for instance, with our Old Faithful example, these were our frequencies. So the cumulative frequency in the first class, I have 2. The second class, I added 0, so I'm still at 2 for my cumulative. The next one had 7 more, so now my cumulative is up to 9. So cumulative, you just add your new observations to all the previous each time. And then it should end with 45, because we had a total of 45 observations that time. You can do the same thing with the relative frequency. Cumulative just means you add it to all the previous. So a cumulative relative frequency, you're just adding the relative frequency plus the new. Okay. In Ojive, we aren't really going to use this. I'm not going to assess it. It will not be on any test or quiz. But it is in the book, so I just thought I'd throw it out there in case you ever heard that word. It is just a graph of those cumulative frequencies. So the Ojive has the current value plus everything prior. And then it would, of course, always end at your total number of observations. All right. Just a couple more. So time series data is anytime the value of the variable is measured at different points in time. So time series, it has to do with time. All right. When I am looking at, populations in different years. So in 2000, the population of this town was this. In 2004, the population was this. I'm measuring it at different points in time. That's time series. Typically, that's just represented with a time series plot, which is just a typical line graph. So kind of like the frequency polygon, except we don't have midpoints and we don't have to connect it to 0. So we would probably do that on Google Sheets. Just type in your X would be the year, the Y would be your observations, and just your basic line graph from those. Okay, so lots of different types of graphs. You may be asked to make any of these. So the important thing is just kind of knowing if I say frequency polygon, what is that? If I say bar graph, what is that? If I say time series, what is that? So I think the last thing I had on here was just an example of what your time series graph would look like. So this one gave a year and the closing value of the Dow. And so you see it's just a line graph, the years on the X, and then just plotted each of those points and connected them with a line. So nothing too crazy there. Most of these graphs you would want to make on Google Sheets. It would be the easiest option. Do you guys have any questions for me? Okay. So this was a pretty brief section. So you can probably knock out at least one of these assignments today. So the homework for this one, it's mostly just reading graphs, or I think it does have you make a few. I will open up on Classroom again a place for you to submit Google Sheets for any graphs that you make on your Chromebook. But both of these assignments, we will have class time to work tomorrow. We will also spend some review time.